everybody, it's me, Miss Sandlin, and we finished Percy Jackson last week, at least the third book in the series. Now, I know what some of y'all might be thinking. You might be thinking, oh yeah, we're going to read Percy Jackson and the Battle of the Labyrinth, and we're going to see what happens to Percy and Nico and Annabeth and all our friends there. But here's my thinking. I won't be able to finish the whole Percy Jackson series before school is out. Now, if you are really desperate for me to keep reading Percy Jackson and finish the whole series, you comment and you let me know, and maybe I'll keep on reading it even into the summertime, and you can just keep on checking the YouTube videos. But I found a book that will allow us to read basically a chapter a day and finish it right as school is officially getting out on May 21st. And it's a book that may prep you for next year. And on top of that, it's probably my favorite book ever. I really love it. I'm really excited to share it with you guys. I read it for the very first time when I was in 5th grade. And that is The Magician's Nephew, The Chronicles of Narnia, Book 1. Now, it's written a lot different than Percy Jackson. I know we've been really stuck on him for a while. This one still has to do with magic and adventure. But instead of taking place in basically modern times, Percy Jackson probably takes place in like the early 2010s. But this is going to take place in London instead of America, and a long, long time before y'all are born. So you'll get the exact setting and time once we get into the book. But it's a beautiful story. It's one of my favorites. And next year, one of the books that your reading, English, whatever you want to call them, teachers in the middle school might read to you is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is book 2 of this series. So I thought maybe reading book 1 now as like a prequel would be nice before you read the next one. So this is The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. The C.S. stands for Clive Staples Lewis. Bless his heart. His mother named him Clive Staples. He was known as his friends. He was known by his friends as Jack. And if you guys have also heard of the Lord of the Rings movies or books, that author is not this one, but they were close friends, which is pretty cool. All right, I'm just going to get right into it. I'll read the little blurb here, the summary, and then I will get right into chapter 1. The secret passage to the house next door leads to a brand new world. Narnia, where horses sometimes grow wings and talking beasts are called to life. A new world full of magic, where the adventures begin. Diggory and Polly meet and become friends one cold, wet summer in London. Their summers aren't nearly as nice as ours. Their lives burst into adventure when Uncle Andrew, who thinks he's a magician, sends them hurtling to somewhere else. They find their way to a new land, Narnia. But when they awaken an evil sorceress, Polly and Diggory are sent on a quest to stop her before she destroys the world that they've just discovered. All right. Chapter 1 is called The Wrong Door. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were still looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. So this is kind of dating the book. Sherlock Holmes, he's a fictional character, but this book is saying he's alive. Sherlock Holmes was around in the early 1900s, so like 1898 and like 1911-ish, in that time period. So a long time ago, over 100 years. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than now. So you had to wear stiff, like, firm-pressed collar. But meals were nicer, and as for sweets, I won't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. And in those days, there lived in London a girl named Polly Plummer. She lived in one of a long row of houses which were all joined together. One morning, she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled up from the garden next door and put his face over the wall. Polly was very surprised, because up till now, there had never been any children in that house, but only Mr. Ketterley and Miss Ketterley, a brother and sister, an old bachelor and old maid, living together. So she looked up, full of curiosity. The face of the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth and then had a good cry, and then dried his face with his hands. As a matter of fact, this was very nearly what he had been doing. "Hello," said Polly. "Hello," said the boy. "What's your name?" "Polly," said Polly. "What's yours?" "Diggory," said the boy. "I say, what a funny name," said Polly. "It isn't half so funny as Polly," said Diggory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "No, it isn't," said Diggory. "At any rate, I do wash my face," said Polly, "which is what you need to do, especially after—" And then she stopped. She had been going to say, "after you've been blubbering," but she thought that wouldn't be very polite. "All right, I have then," said Diggory, in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he had been crying. "And so would you," he went on, "if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this." "London isn't a hole," said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice on her, and he went on. And this book has pictures. So here's Polly and Diggory. And in case you can't see, there is a lot of dirt and stuff on his face. "And if your father was away in India, and you had to come and live with an aunt and uncle who's mad, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die," then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears. I didn't know. I'm sorry," said Polly humbly. And then, because she hardly knew what else to say, turned to Diggory, and also to turn Diggory's mind to cheerful subjects, she asked, "Is Mr. Ketterley really mad?" When they say mad, they mean crazy. Like an evil, mad scientist. He's crazy. "Well, either he's mad," said Diggory, "or there's some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there. Well, that looks fishy to begin with. And then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at mealtimes, he never even tries to talk to her. She always shuts him up. She says, 'Don't worry the boy, Andrew,' or 'I'm sure Diggory won't want to hear about that,' or else, 'Now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go out and play in the garden?' What sort of things does he try to say? I don't know. He never gets far enough. But there's more than that. One night, it was last night in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, and I don't much care for going past them either, I'm sure I heard a yell. Perhaps he keeps a mad wife shut up in there." So they think maybe his uncle keeps like a secret crazy lady stuck in the attic. "Yes, I've thought of that. Or perhaps he's a coiner. Or he might have been a pirate, like the man at the beginning of Treasure Island, and be always hiding from his old shipmates." They have quite the imagination. But if I was in the position Diggory was in, with my mom about to die, then I might be thinking of crazy things too. "How exciting," said Polly. "I never knew your house was so interesting." "You may think it interesting," said Diggory, "but you wouldn't like it if you had to sleep there. How would you like to lie awake listening for Uncle Andrew's step to come creeping along the passage to your room? And he has such awful eyes." And that was how Polly and Diggory got to know each other. And as it was just the beginning of the summer holidays, and neither of them was going to the sea that year, they met nearly every day. Their adventures began chiefly because it was one of the wettest and coldest summers they had been for years. That drove them to do indoor things. you might say indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of a candle in a big house, or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box room attic of her house, you would find the cistern and a dark place behind it which you could get into by a little careful climbing. So she discovered like a secret passageway in her attic. The dark place was like a long tunnel with brick wall on one side and sloping roof on the other. In the roof, there were little chunks of light between the slates. There was no floor in this tunnel, but you had to step from rafter to rafter, and between there was only plaster. If you've ever seen a house being built, you know the plaster is not very strong. It wouldn't hold a person. If you stepped on this, you would find yourself falling through the ceiling of the room below. Polly had used the bit of the tunnel just beside the cistern as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and the seats of broken kitchen chairs, and things of that sort, and spread them across from rafter to rafter, so as to make a bit of a floor. Here she kept a cash box containing various treasures, and a story she was writing, and usually a few apples. She had often drunk a quiet bottle of ginger beer in there, like ginger ale. The old bottles made it look more like a smuggler's cave. So here's a picture of Polly's attic hideaway. She's got all kinds of things stashed in there, like her own little secret place. Diggory quite liked the cave. She wouldn't let him see the story, but he was more interested in exploring. "Look here," he said. "How long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends?" "No," said Polly. "The walls don't go out to the roof. It goes on. I don't know how far." "Then we could get the length of the whole row of houses." "So we could," said Polly. "And oh, I say!" "What?" "We could get into the other houses." "Yes, and get taken up for burglars? No thanks." They don't want people to think they're breaking into each other's houses, which, if they're going from roof to roof, from attic to attic, they kind of are. "Don't be so jolly clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours." "What about it?" "Why, it's the empty one. Daddy says it's always been empty ever since we came here." "I suppose we ought to have a look at it then," said Diggory. He was a good deal more excited than you'd have thought from the way he spoke, for of course he was thinking, just as you would have been, of all the reasons why the house might have been empty so long. So was Polly. Neither of them said the word haunted, and both felt that once the thing had been suggested, it would be feeble not to do it. "Shall we go and try it now?" said Diggory. "All right," said Polly. "Don't if you'd rather not," said Diggory. "Well, I'm game if you are," said she. "How are we to know when we're in the next house but one?" So they're trying to figure out how they're going to keep track of what houses they're in. If there's like this big, long, secret passage going in this row of houses with no yard in between, then how are they going to know when they've gotten from one house to another? They decided they would have to go into the box room and walk across it, taking steps as long as the steps from one rafter to the next. That would give them an idea of how many rafters went to a room. Then they would allow about 4 more for the passage between the 2 attics in Polly's house, then the same number for the maid's bedroom as for the box room. That would give them the length of the house. When they had done that distance twice, they would be at the end of Diggory's house. Any door they came to after that would let them into an attic of the empty house. So they've decided to count the rafters so they know how much is in Polly's, and if all the houses are built exactly the same, which they are, then they know how far they need to go. "But I don't expect it to be really empty at all," said Diggory. "Well, what do you expect?" "I expect someone lives there in secret, only coming in and out at night, with a dark lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of desperate criminals and get a reward. It's all rot to say a house would be empty all those years unless there was some mystery." "Daddy thought it might be the drains," said Polly. "Ugh, grown-ups are always thinking of uninteresting explanations," said Diggory. Now that they were talking by daylight in the attic instead of by candlelight in the smuggler's cave, it seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. When they had measured the attic, they had to get a pencil and do a sum, so they had to add it up. They both got different answers to do it at first, and even when they agreed, I'm not sure they got it right. They were in a hurry to start on the exploration. "We mustn't make a sound," said Polly, as they climbed in again behind the cistern. Because it was such an important occasion, they took a candle each. Polly had a good store of these in her cave. It was very dark and dusty and draughty, and they stepped from rafter to rafter without a word, except when they whispered to one another. "We're opposite your attic now, or this must be halfway through our house." And neither of them stumbled, and the candles did not go out. And at last they came where they could see a little door in the brick wall on their right. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch, as there often is on the inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to turn. So there was like a little latch that prevented them from just pushing it open. They would have to turn the handle. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said Polly, just as she had said before. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither would draw back. Have any of y'all been in a situation where someone is like challenging you to do something and you're a little intimidated, you're a little scared, but you do it anyway? That's what they're doing. Diggory pushed around the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open and the sudden daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, they saw that they were looking not into a deserted attic, but into a furnished room. But it seemed empty enough. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her, and she blew out her candle and stepped out into the strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but furnished like a sitting room. Every bit of the walls was lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves was full of books. A fire was burning in the grate. You'll remember it was a very cold, wet summer that year. And in front of the fireplace, with its back toward them, was a high-backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, and filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table, piled with all sorts of things. Printed books, and books of the sort you write in, and ink bottles, and pens, and sealing wax, and a microscope. But what she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray, with a number of rings on it. They were in pairs, a yellow one and a green one together, then a little space, and then another yellow one and another green one. They were no bigger than ordinary rings, and no one could help noticing them because they were so bright. They were the most beautifully shiny things you can imagine. If Polly had been a very little younger, she would have wanted to put one in her mouth. Here's Polly and Diggory entering the fully furnished attic room that they expected to be completely empty, or haunted, or whatever. The room was so quiet that you noticed the ticking of the clock at once. And yet, as she now found, it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a very, very faint humming sound. If vacuum cleaners had been invented in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a hoover being worked a long way off, several rooms away and several floors below. But it was a nicer sound than that, a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly hear it. "It's all right, there's no one here," said Polly over her shoulder to Diggory. She was speaking above a whisper now, and Diggory came out blinking and looking extremely dirty, as indeed Polly was too. They were climbing around in the attics. "This is no good," he said. "It's not an empty house at all. We'd better leave before anyone comes." "What do you think those are?" said Polly, pointing at the colored rings. "Oh, come on," said Diggory. "The sooner—" He never finished what he was going to say, for at that moment something happened. The high-backed chair in front of the fire moved suddenly, and there rose up out of it, like a pantomime demon, coming up out of a trap-door, the alarming form of Diggory's Uncle Andrew. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Diggory's house, and in the forbidden study. Both children said, "Oh!" and realized their terrible mistake. They felt they ought to have known all along that they hadn't gone near far enough. Uncle Andrew was tall and very thin. He had a long, clean-shaven face with a sharply pointed nose and extremely bright eyes and a great tousled mop of gray hair. Diggory was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever looked before. Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was. For the very first thing Uncle Andrew did was to walk across to the door of the room, shut it, and turn the key in the lock. Then he turned around, fixed the children with his bright eyes, and smiled, showing all his teeth. "There," he said. "Now my fool of a sister can't get at you." It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would be expected to do. Polly's heart came into her mouth, and she and Diggory started backing toward the little door they had come in by. Uncle Andrew was too quick for them. He got behind them and shut that door too, and stood in front of it. Then he rubbed his hands and made his knuckles crack. He had very long, beautifully white fingers. "I am delighted to see you," he said. "2 children are just what I wanted." Y'all, I don't know about this Uncle Andrew. He seems creepy. "Please, Mr. Kettley," said Polly. "It's nearly my dinner time, and I've got to go home. Will you let us out, please?" "No, not just yet," said Uncle Andrew. "This is too good an opportunity to miss. I wanted 2 children, you see, and I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I've tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work. But then a guinea pig can't tell you anything back, and you can't explain to it how to come back." "Look here, Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. "It really is dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out." "Must?" said Uncle Andrew. Diggory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say anything, but the glances meant, "Isn't this dreadful? And we must humor him." So they're just trying to make sure he doesn't do anything for real crazy. "If you let us go for our dinner now," said Polly, "we could come back after dinner." "Ah, but how do I know that you would?" said Uncle Andrew with a cunning smile. Then he seemed to change his mind. "Well, well," he said, "if you really must go, I suppose you must. I can't expect 2 youngsters like you to find it much fun talking to an old buffer like me." He sighed and went on. "You've no idea how lovely I sometimes... Oh, excuse me. Not lovely. You've no idea how lonely I sometimes am. But no matter. Go to your dinner, but I must give you a present before you go. It's not every day that I see a little girl in my dingy old study, especially if I may say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself." Polly began to think he might not really be mad after all. "Wouldn't you like a ring, my dear?" said Uncle Andrew to Polly. "Do you mean one of those yellow or green ones?" said Polly. "How lovely!" "Not a green one," said Uncle Andrew. "I'm afraid I can't give the green ones away, but I'd be delighted to give you any of the yellow ones. With my love, of course. Come and try one on." Polly had now quite got over her fright, and felt sure that the old gentleman was not mad, and there was certainly something strangely attractive about those bright rings. She moved over to the tray. "Y'all got a bad feeling about this? 'Cause I don't know about this." "Why, I declare," she said, "that humming noise gets louder here. It's almost as if the rings were making it." "What a funny fancy, my dear," said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded a very natural laugh, but Diggory had seen an eager, almost greedy look on his face. "Polly, don't be a fool," he shouted. "Don't touch them." But it was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings, and immediately, without a flash or noise or any warning at all, there was no Polly. Diggory and his uncle were alone in the room. And that's the end of chapter 1. So, Polly has vanished, and creepy Uncle Andrew vanished her, made her disappear with some kind of weird rings, and now Diggory's left alone with crazy old Uncle Andrew. So, we will pick up tomorrow, Tuesday, with chapter 2. Let me know what you guys think of this slightly different fiction book. It is written a lot older, but I think it still holds, can capture your attention even now in the age of technology and all that mess. Alright, see you guys on Tuesday.